This week, our focus is going to be on organic evolution and natural selection. If we did this in the classroom, I hand out cards to all the students and ask them to submit a red card that has a question, a comment, a concern they have about evolution or natural selection, or something they feel like they don't understand, and a green card where they get to share something that they do understand, that they do know. And based on those cards, that's where a lot of this presentation comes from. So right up front, I want to address something that's a very common concern among students, um, about evolution and natural selection as an idea. So I like to start as with a reminder um, that this is a science class and we focus on scientific explanations. And if we go back to the beginning of the semester, a good solid scientific explanation has several key characteristics, and those are listed on these slides. It has to be a natural cause. It must be supported by available data. It has to be something that we can test and that we could potentially prove to be incorrect. Um, it has to be subject to revision or refinement or negation. We have to be able to make it better and criticize it. It should be predictive. It should tell us something that maybe we don't know, or suggest something we don't know and give us new areas to research. Organic evolution and natural selection meet all of these requirements. And so this is some really solid science. One of the questions that very often comes up is concerns about there being a theological conflict. And at the core of this is the difference between science, where we investigate natural cause, and religion and theology, where there can be a discussion of special cause. Very often people are concerned about the relationship of humans and animals, like people evolved from monkeys, for example. People didn't evolve from monkeys. We have a common ancestor. Um, that is a kind of a long and detailed explanation. Um, Evolution can be observed. We can observe it because it happens over on the scale of generations. So if you have organisms that can produce a generation in a relatively short period of time, you can observe evolution and natural selection. And in fact, we're experiencing part of that right now with the evolution of the COVID-19 virus. It is something that we didn't see and didn't exist probably a year ago. And it does exist now. And the reason that it's so effective at infecting people across the planet is that evolution and natural selection have actually produced a really, really good virus. And one of the pet peeves I hear sometimes from scientists is the idea that it's only a theory, because in science, everything's a theory. That's as good as it gets for us as scientists. And I have a few slides on science and religion that you can look at your leisure in the PowerPoint slide file, so you're welcome to download that. You should know that stances on evolution vary quite widely. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, has no problems with evolution. In the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, for example, has no problems, while the Missouri Synod has a huge problem with evolution and operates on the understanding that the earth is only a few thousand years old. So you really need to ask a religious leader if you want to know the position of your religion when it comes to evolution. So I'm going to assume you guys understand theory and hypothesis. Here are the keys to our definition. Organic evolution is changes in life through time. It's the development of complex life forms and the development of a variety of life forms. So organic means life, evolution is change through time, so that's changes in life through time. Natural selection is our mechanism responsible for organic evolution. It occurs through mutation and selection. And the survival of the fittest is usually what people hear with respect to natural selection. It's a little more complicated than that. It's the survival of the fittest for an ecological niche. And we will talk about that a little bit more in the second part of this slide presentation. So some important terminology to keep in mind as we go through these slides. Number one, the definition of a species. A species is a reproductively isolated group of living organisms. And I encourage everyone to read Darwin's Origin of the Species. It's over 150 years old. It's an amazing work of science because of all the evidence he lays out. One of the things he discusses is what we mean by species, because it turns out that things that we think of sometimes as being different species can actually reproduce with each other. So, for example, donkeys and horses are different species, but they can reproduce with each other. Their offspring is sterile. Their offspring can't reproduce. Dogs and wolves we think of as different species, but they're actually not considered biologically separate. They're considered, if anything, subspecies because dogs and wolves can reproduce with each other and their offspring can have babies. So the line between two different species is not as solid as we often like to think it is. Another important term is going to be population. Population is all the members of a species living in an area. So, for example, all of the white-tailed deer in the Illinois Valley would be a population of the species of white-tailed deer. A community is all of the populations in an area. So in the Illinois Valley, the community would be the white-tailed deer, the oak trees, the grass, and every other population of living organisms added together. That would be the community. And what I don't have listed on here would be the ecosystem, which would be adding the community to the physical environment. A habitat is the organism's physical location within a community or within an ecosystem. It's where the organism lives. And the niche is what the organism does. It's the organism's place or its duties within a habitat or an ecosystem. So those terms are important, and you can download the slides from my website and take a look at that in more detail if you need to. So let's get into the evidence. We're going to start with organic evolution, and it actually starts in geology. One of the things to know about Charles Darwin is that when he went to college in the early 1800s, geology was kind of a new science. But also, if you studied the sciences, most students and researchers didn't necessarily focus on a specific science, especially the students didn't. And so Darwin worked with some of the very, very early researchers in geology. And one of the key things that we know about the Earth is that the surface is covered with layers of sediment. And when we look at those layers, the newest sediment is the layer that's on top. And as we go into deeper layers of sediment, we're looking at older and older material. And when we do this, it turns out that we can start correlating or matching up layers in one area with layers in another area. And this allows us to develop what we call in geology the time scale, or the relative time scale. It is basically a kind of a universal stack of layers that we can trace all the way around the planet, or we can match up a layer in one place with a layer in another. They might not be the same sediment, but we can tell that they're from the same period of time. When we look at those layers, we find fossils. And it turns out that if you look at the layers on the bottom, the oldest rocks, the fossils that we find there are simple organisms only. The very oldest rocks have only single-celled organisms for fossils. A little bit above that, we find fossils of very simple organisms that we call stromatolites. Modern stromatolites that we can go out and actually take a sample of and look at are essentially colonies of different types of bacteria. And then as we get to younger rocks, we find things that have shells. All this very early life is really limited to the ocean. And as we get to more recent times, we find more organisms similar to those things living today. So it's slightly younger rocks that have things that live on the land, that have the early land plants, and then rocks that were deposited after that have the dinosaurs, and rocks deposited after that have the large mammals. And we see the same kind of change happening in things that record what was living in the ocean at the time. So we see this very dramatic change through time in the fossil record. We also find this with geologic distribution of organisms. Many organisms are similar, but unique depending on where you go. And they're confined to specific areas like islands or continents if you're looking at land organisms, or water bodies if you're looking at marine organisms. And this includes both modern and fossil organisms. And this distribution we can also see has changed through time. So one of the really interesting things that Charles Darwin got to do when he graduated from college is he went on a 5-year round the world cruise, if you will. It was actually on a wooden ship, a sailing ship. Conditions probably weren't cruise worthy. But his job on that ship was to collect plants and animals and anything else he thought was interesting and send them back to England. And that's exactly what he did. And one of the things that he noticed, for example, in South America, was that modern organisms like the guanaco matched up with extinct organisms that he found fossils of in the same area. So he saw that life had changed through time, but there was a sort of a similar or a seemingly related population of organisms living in the area. He famously collected birds when he was on the Galapagos Islands. His impression of these birds, he was not a bird person, was that they were all the same, or that they were all different species, very different types of birds. When he got back to England, the person that he had sent the birds to said, "Where'd you find all the finches?" So he was surprised to learn upon his return to England that all of these very different looking birds were actually very closely related species. And once he got back to England, the other thing that he started looking at was the anatomy of organisms. So he gets back home, he gets married, he starts to have children, he lives in the country on a farm, and he starts dissecting all different kinds of organisms and reading up on embryology and finding out lots of very interesting things about life on the planet. And that's where we'll start up the next set of slides.